A national Christian magazine had a stunning article in it a few years back. A pastor wrote, detailing how for a period of several years he had functioned both as a pastor and as a person addicted to illicit sexual experiences. Now, what did this involve? First of all, an obsession with pornography, magazines such as Playboy, Penthouse, and more hardcore fare. Second, visits to strip clubs where nude dancers worked, and it even involved physical adultery. He was a regular customer of established call girls. This pastor had the kind of ministry that involved a fair amount of travel, so there were frequent opportunities for this kind of sin to flourish and grow in his life. Now, here is the ironic and painful point. This Christian minister did love God. He preached about God, and in his heart he meant what he preached. He believed the principles of the Christian faith, and he had surrendered his life to Jesus. If anyone ever knew about his own helplessness, it was this man, this pastor. He had a love for Jesus and a love for this sexual addiction. And the two loves were trying to exist simultaneously. This miserable man was trying to manage an impossible coexistence. This brings me to one of the most challenging discussions and debates that can exist in this process of becoming a born-again Christian. What does a person do when a love for Jesus and a desire for sin try to coexist? This pastor's case may seem like an extreme one, but that's only because sins of a sexual nature seem worse to us than all the other ones. We in the clergy call this a moral fall. But is it more of a fall than other kinds of commandment breaking? How many of us have tried to manage a coexisting love for Jesus with a love for money? A love for Jesus partnered up with pride. A love for Jesus and a habit of deception and dishonesty. Every single one of us has felt this dilemma of trying to be on two sets of railroad tracks at the same time. So this is a very practical question. It's no accident that this series of devotions is titled, Your Most Radical Decision. What does it mean to become a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian on an ongoing daily basis? There are still 10 talks to go, and I hope you're sensing with me two things. First, what an exciting and life-changing subject this is. And second, how one book or just one sermon or 100 devotionals simply aren't adequate to this vital discussion. You can't tell this story in 24 chats. We're simply scratching the surface. The Bible recognizes that a two-track war is going to exist, even in the hearts of God's believers, especially in the hearts of God's believers. Jesus himself warned, no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. That's Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. Now, God and money is simply one of the many double features we humanly try to maintain. Jesus could just as easily have said, you cannot serve both God and pride, or God and sexual addiction, or God and selfishness, or God and material possessions. In the long run, Jesus says, you can't worship both at once. Well, put on your seatbelts. Here's the hard question we want to address in the next few studies. What does this mean for our struggling pastor friend? There is a man who does love God. He really does. But he struggles with this overpowering desire for something else at the same time. In your life, there may well be a love for God and a love for some other thing. You can't serve both. You don't want to serve both. But that's exactly where you find yourself. And you know something? you're in good company. As devout a believer as the Apostle Paul described feelings exactly this way himself. The whole chapter 7 of Romans is a cry to the heavens about this very dilemma. Romans 7, verse 15. I do not understand what I do, Paul says. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. This is Paul writing. He's a believer. In the very next verse, he admits, I agree that the law is good. But in verses 18 and 19, he restates his anguish, his problem. I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For what I do is not good that I want to do. No, the evil I do not want to do, this I keep doing. Here is the problem in a nutshell. Loving God and having a love-hate struggle with sin at the very same time. There's something in your life that you keep on doing. You have two masters right there in the living room with you, and you know you can't serve them both. Now, is this a pleasant experience? That pastor who wrote to the Christian magazine was absolutely miserable. He was in agony. It was a living hell, being pulled in two directions that way. And Paul is in that same misery as well. Listen to verse 24. Oh, what a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death? Well, before we go on to the good news that does follow this verse, let's pose the $64 million question. Are you still a Christian while this kind of war goes on? Are you saved or lost? Now, friend, the answer to that question is an exciting one, but it's an answer that takes us several chapters to fully explore. Please, please stay with me and keep your Bible open as we proceed. In order to discover biblical truth on this topic, let's turn to a New Testament story that's found in the book of Mark, chapter 9. Now, this is an experience that happens when Jesus and the 12 disciples have just arrived in Capernaum. Out of the blue, he asks them a question. Verse 33. What were you arguing about on the road? In the more familiar King James Version, the probing question comes this way. What was it that ye disputed among yourselves in the way? I love the way Pastor Morris Venden brings this sorry little story to life. This is the kind of question where you know the questioner already knows the answer. Have you ever had that happen to you? Third grade teacher, who broke the window? She knows. Or mom, Johnny, where'd you leave your geometry book? You know she knows where it is. That's why she's bringing it up. And when Jesus says to his disciples, what were you fellows talking about back there? He already knows the answer, doesn't he? The disciples don't want to answer. There's a long, awkward silence where no one says anything. They kind of kick their feet in the dust and look down at their wristwatches or out the window looking for UFOs. Verse 34 says, but they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Here's the King James rendition. They held their peace. I want to make 2 points about why these 2 verses have meaning for us today. First of all, these were the disciples of Jesus, men who had given their lives to Jesus. They'd abandoned their livelihoods. They left their relatives, surrendered everything in order to follow Jesus. These men were Christians, and they had been for 3 years now. In fact, these 12 men had preached the gospel and healed the sick and raised the dead. They were converted believers. That's point number 1. Point 2 is kind of sobering. These 12 men, even after 3 years of walking and studying with Jesus, still struggled with the sin of pride. Every single one of them still wanted to be prime minister or vice president or sergeant at arms or chief deputy disciple in charge of the others. Each one harbored a desire to be number 1. In fact, 2 of them, James and John, remember, had specifically asked Jesus for that honor with a little bit of coaching from their Hollywood mom. These 2 verses show us a sin that these disciples were committing, and they knew it was sin. They knew it was wrong to covet the top spot, to have a prideful, greedy, grasping nature. Why else would they hold back during the long walk to Capernaum and have this bitter little conversation out of the earshot of Jesus? The disciples of Christ wanted to indulge this sin in this favorite topic. So this was a known sin, a deliberate sin, a planned sin, even an ongoing 3-year sin. Let me ask you then, is this Bible illustration relevant to our topic? Is it on point, as the lawyers say? Here you have born-again Christians, followers of Jesus, who are still committing sin. And not just committing sin, but deliberately committing sin. They're not slipping on banana peels and accidentally blurting out an isolated, X-rated word. No. This is conscious, premeditated sin. This is a Bible story that exactly parallels the experience of our pastor friend who was committing the sin of adultery, except that pride is actually worse than adultery. Listen, friend. What does Jesus do about these 12 sinning Christians? Tune in tomorrow and let's find out. Our topic, you 12 guys are fired.